Chapter 391. Zhaoke panted, her eyes wide open. She looked at the man in front of her, and her pupils constricted. Not only did the old policeman recognize him, but Zhaoke also recognized him. Young lady, this is really fate. Or perhaps it's better to say that justice has long arms. The old policeman smiled, then looked at the young policeman beside him. Bring her to the police car. Wait a minute, search her body and her back. Zhaoke couldn't resist. In the end, they found Ronglei's phone in her back. Zhaoke screamed, "You can't lock me up. I'm Tang Ziyuan's wife. I'm the wife of the CEO of Shengyuan Corporation." The old policeman smiled silently and looked at Zhaoke. Shengyuan's CEO seems very young, right? He's not even 30, and he doesn't have such an old wife. He knew Tang Ziyuan, the former CEO of Shengyuan Corporation. I'll hang up, Mr. Tang. As for whether you're guilty or not, we'll leave it to the law to decide. There was a trace of pity in the old policeman's eyes. Until now, he could still remember the coldness in the girl's eyes. It was a disregard for life. Finally, he managed to catch her. Life was determined by the heart. Even if this woman obtained wealth with her beauty, one day, she would still fall in her own hands. The old policeman smoked a cigarette to calm himself down, waiting for the forensic doctor. There must be someone behind this. Otherwise, how could it be so accurate? The moment he arrived, he saw the crime scene. However, he couldn't find any clues about the person who called the police. That person did it very discreetly, dialing a public phone. Later, when he found the surveillance camera, he only saw the person in disguise. He couldn't see the person's face. Zhaoke was taken away, her expression a little dull. She knew that she was finished. She killed someone, and Tang Ziyuan definitely wouldn't help her. Zhaoke was taken downstairs and escorted to the police car. From beginning to end, she didn't say a word. The door of the police car opened and closed. After about an hour, the old policeman and the forensic doctor came down together. Ronglei was also carried down, his body covered with a white cloth. "Oh, Zhou, the killer is very cruel. Actually, one stab is enough to kill the victim, but he twisted the victim's heart more than 10 times. The forensic doctor smoked a cigarette with old Zhou at the door. He could not help but sigh. Officer Zhou pinched the cigarette and took a few deep puffs. When he thought back to that scene, his heart trembled. I've seen this woman 20 years ago. It was also a murder case. I think we should reopen that case and try it again. The forensic doctor smiled. Okay, do as you see fit. He looked up at the sky. It's getting late. Let's go back to the police station first. The two of them got into the police car. The car siren sounded and sped away. Behind their car, a white Himalayan was parked there. Pei Chi sat in the car and stared blankly at the direction in which the car left. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and there was a hint of bitterness in the corner of his mouth. Zhaoke wanted to kill her, causing Jean Rong to become a vegetable, and she personally sent Zhaoke to prison. She closed her eyes and leaned against the back of the chair, feeling indescribably tired and desolate. She didn't feel any joy, only sorrow. Zhaoke was the person who gave birth to her. She couldn't figure out whether Zhaoke was her sin, or she was Zhaoke's sin. Just then, the phone beside her rang. She glanced at it, and saw that it was Tang Xian. Her heart trembled, and after a long time, she picked up the phone. Her voice was a little hoarse. Tang Xian? Tang Xian's voice was sweet. Chi, I have good news for you. My mom is going to Macau for a few days, and my dad allowed me to stay with my brother. Chapter 392. Pei Chi was a little absent-minded. Zhaoke said she would go to Macau for a few days, but Tang Xian, Zhaoke couldn't go back. Her heart was filled with guilt towards Tang Xian. No matter what, she made Tang Xian lose her mother. Just like her, she would be a child without a mother in the future. Pei Chi pursed her lips. Her throat was so dry that she couldn't squeeze out a word. At this moment, she didn't know what to say to Tang Xian, as if everything she said would be a lie. Tang Xian didn't get a response, so she acted coquettishly. Chi, okay. Pei Chi took a long time to find her voice. Where are you? I'll pick you up. Tang Xian cheered. I'm at home. I'll pack my things immediately. Wait for me at the intersection in front of my house. Tang Xian was also bored. After saying that happily, she hung up the phone and ran upstairs. As soon as she went upstairs, she bumped into Tang Zun, who had a gloomy face. Tang Xian almost fell. If it weren't for Tang Zun holding her, she might have rolled down the stairs. Just as she was about to complain, Tang Xian saw that her father's face was a little pale. Dad. Tang Xian looked at him carefully. What's wrong? Tang Ziyuan received a call from the police station. Although he was already angry, he still felt pity for his little daughter. He suppressed his anger and said lightly, "Go to your brother's place for a few days. I have something to do." Tang Xian was suspicious. Is it something related to the company? Her father clearly didn't care about the company's matters. Tang Ziyuan reached out and patted Tang Xian's little head, saying nothing. He had already gone downstairs and said as he walked, "I'll ask the driver to send you to your brother's place later. Don't run around and be obedient." Oh, Tang Xian replied gloomily. She felt that something was wrong with her father today. On the other side, Pei Chi put away the phone. She closed her eyes for a while. How should she face Tang Xian? But she also knew that indulging Zhao Ku was unfair to Jinrong. It was also unfair to Lin Yun. Zhao Ku should be punished by the law, even if she used improper methods to take Ronglei's life. But didn't Ronglei also participate in that matter? Pei Chi-Chi's lips curled into a bitter smile. Would her father blame her in the underworld for hurting the woman he loved the most? But even if he wanted to blame her, even if Zhao Ku was the woman who gave birth to her, even if Tang Xian was in the middle, she would never regret what she did. Zhao Ku owed too much. She should pay it back. When she wanted to start the car, her legs were weak. After calming down for a long time, she drove the car to Yinhui. On the way to Yinhui, her car brushed past Tang Ziyuan's car. Tang Ziyuan's heart was not calm, so he did not see Pei Chi, but she saw him. He must have gone to the police station for Zhao Ku's matter. When they passed by each other, her eyes were calm. So be it. She picked up Tang Xian. Tang Xian was a little depressed, but Pei Chi knew it. She did not say anything, and only helped her put her luggage in her car. After getting into the car, she said in a low voice, "Tang Xian, I'm going to the suburbs in a few days. The company's land is being auctioned, and I have to move." Tang Xian looked up and looked at her pitifully. "Chi, you can only take me in for a few days, and you don't want to see me anymore?" She knew that Chi and her brother had not reconciled, and she would not want to see her. Chapter 393. Pei Chi looked at her and couldn't bear to see her like that. "You can still come and find me after I've settled down," Tang Xian replied with an "oh." She was still a little dejected. Pei Chi wanted to say something but didn't. "I'll give my brother a call," Tang Xian suddenly said. "I'll tell Dad that I'm staying at my brother's place." Pei Chi nodded and started the car. But her attention was still on Tang Xian. Tang Xian took out her phone and dialed Tang Yu's number. After the call went through, she sniffed and said, "Brother, I want to go to Chi-Chi's place to stay for a few days. If Dad asks, tell him I'm at your place." On the other side, Tang Yu sat in his office with his phone in hand. His eyes were silent. In front of him, there was a hospital report. He had watched it over and over again many times. At this moment, when he heard Tang Xian's soft voice, he was a little dazed and stunned. "Brother?" Tang Xian called out to him softly like a kitten. Tang Yu came back to his senses and closed his eyes. His slender body slumped against the back of the chair, and he held his forehead with one hand. After a long time, he let out a long sigh. "I understand." Tang Xian didn't dare to disturb him and quickly hung up. Tang Yu put down his phone and his eyes were still on the report. Tang Xian and Pei Chi were related by blood. Tang Xian and him were not related by blood. Of course, he and Chi were not related by blood either. What this meant couldn't be clearer. Pei Chi was Zhao Ku's child and Tang Xian wasn't Tang Ziyuan's biological child. All these years, Tang Ziyuan had been a fool. Zhao Ku had never been pregnant with his child. It was a pity that Lin Yun lost the child because of a woman who was nothing. Tang Yu looked at it for a long time. Suddenly, the door was pushed open. He looked up and saw Meng Qingqing standing by the door in a daze. Tang Yu put the report into the drawer and looked at Meng Qingqing. What's wrong? Meng Qingqing's eyes were a little dazed. After a long time, he came in and closed the door. With his back against the door, he said softly, Zhao Ku has been arrested. Tang Yu responded faintly. Then, he took out a cigarette from the pack and lit it. He didn't smoke it, but just let it burn between his fingers. Seeing his cold appearance, Meng Qingqing walked over and placed her hands on both sides of his desk. She said seriously, It's true. Zhao Ku killed a pretty boy. That pretty boy was called Rong Lei. Tang Yu still did not make a sound and only smiled faintly. In Meng Qingqing's eyes, he only felt that his smile was forced. You don't care at all? There was a hint of probing on Meng Qingqing's face. Also, don't you think this matter has something to do with the thing you asked me to investigate last time? Meng Qingqing was already pointing at Pei Qiqi. Tang Yu's gaze became a little sharp. He knew that Qingqing had always been smart and could not hide things from him. Chapter 394. Pei Qiqi brought Tang Xian to her house. Tang Xian was still a child. She was still preoccupied with her own matters, but once she reached her house, she forgot about them. She curled up on the sofa, watching TV and eating snacks like a little mouse. Pei Qiqi sat by the side and looked at her. There was an indescribable feeling in her heart. Tang Xian watched the TV and stole glances at Pei Qiqi. In the end, she couldn't help but cry out, Qiqi, I'll be embarrassed if you keep looking at me like that. She secretly reached out her little paw. You're not thinking of hitting on me, are you? Pei Qiqi didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She reached out and stroked her long hair. How did you know all this? Comics. Tang Xian said happily. I secretly bought them behind my mother's back. There's a whole box under my bed. She doesn't know. As she said this, she probably thought of Zhao Ku. Her expression became a little gloomy. Pei Qiqi reached out and stroked Tang Xian's long hair. She sighed silently in her heart. At this moment, she didn't know that Tang Xian wasn't Tang Ziyuan's child. If she knew, she might not have been so decisive when she did this. Tang Xian smiled at her. Qiqi, you're the best. Really? But if Tang Xian knew that she was the one who put her mother in jail, she would definitely hate her to the core. But there was no turning back. She and Zhao Ku were gone. Up until now, Pei Qiqi didn't regret it. She couldn't bear the word good. The only person she felt sorry for was Tang Xian. Tang Xian was like a little clingy spirit. Pei Qiqi accompanied her for a while before going to cook. She stood in the kitchen, cutting vegetables. From time to time, she would look at the sky outside the window. At this time, it was almost dusk. Everywhere was desolate. She was in a daze, but her hands didn't stop moving. She cut her hand. She felt a wave of pain. She lowered her head and found that there was a cut on her hand. Blood slowly seeped out. The blood was very similar to Jinrong's blood. It was also similar to the blood that Rong Lei lost under Zhao Ku's hands. She was a little numb. She didn't feel the pain and let the blood flow. She raised her face and forced back the tears in her eyes. No matter how ruthless she was, the one who was sent to prison was Zhao Ku, the woman who gave birth to her. She, too, had spent 10 months in that woman's belly. However, she did not have the chance to call her mother. Instead, she locked her up in prison. She didn't know if Zhao Ku had ruined her life, or if she had ruined Zhao Ku's stable life. He couldn't calculate it clearly. His hand was still in pain, so he simply bandaged it. Tang Xian, on the other hand, made a fuss and called for a doctor. It's fine. It's just a small injury. Pei Qiqi smiled and patted Tang Xian's shoulder. Tang Xian was worried. Qiqi, let's order takeout. She was afraid that Qiqi would find her troublesome, so she was very considerate. No need. I just need to cook 2 simple dishes. Pei Qiqi lowered her head and looked at the wound on her hand. Her voice was very light. Tang Xian nodded and slid down the sofa. She insisted on being a little helper. As a result, the kitchen was a mess. Pei Qiqi was also a little helpless. By the time they finished eating and cleaned up, it was already 8 o'clock. Tang Xian was also a little tired. She actually fell asleep with her head tilted. Pei Qiqi woke her up. Tang Xian, go back to your room and sleep. Tang Xian turned around. Chi-Chi, I'm so sleepy. As she spoke, she suddenly opened her eyes. As if she was sleepwalking, she said, I have to take my medicine. Chapter 395. I'll go get it for you. Sit down. Pei Chi-Chi wanted to treat Tang Xian as well as she could, but as soon as she left, Tang Xian jumped up and hugged her from behind. Chi-Chi, I'll go get it myself. Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. Tang Xian ran into the bedroom like a little rabbit, took out the medicine, and put it in her palm. She swallowed it with great agitation. Although it was bitter, she smiled sweetly. I'm done. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. What medicine did you take? Tang Xian waved her hand. I've been lacking a vitamin since I was young. It's not a big deal, but Dad and Mom are too worried. Pei Chi-Chi did not say anything else. Tang Xian yawned. Chi-Chi, can I sleep in your room tonight? Sure. She could not reject Tang Xian. She was as soft as a little animal. Tang Xian hopped over and hugged her. Chi-Chi, I'll go wash up. I'll wait for you. Pei Chi-Chi laughed. Didn't you just tell me not to do anything to you? Tang Xian stuck out her tongue and smiled embarrassedly. She immediately went into the room. She washed up and laid on the bed, counting the goats while waiting for Pei Chi-Chi. She waited for a long time, but Pei Chi-Chi did not come. She could not help but urge Pei Chi-Chi. Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi gave a muffled grunt, but she still didn't come. Just like that, Tang Xian waited until she almost fell asleep. She closed her eyes and finally fell asleep. Before she fell asleep, she even called out, Chi-Chi twice. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips when she heard that there was no sound from inside. She curled up on the sofa and watched the television for a long time before turning on the news channel. She looked at the screen carefully. She was eager, but also afraid to see Zhao Ke. Finally, at 10 o'clock, the case was broadcasted. On the screen, Zhao Ke's face was censored, and the introduction of Zhao Ke was that she was the wife of a famous person. After that, all the media was guessing which celebrity's wife this was. After all, behind this murder case, the exciting story of a famous wife and a gigolo was more intriguing than the case itself. Pei Chi-Chi curled up on the sofa in a relatively safe corner, watching Zhao Ke receive the punishment she deserved. Suddenly, the phone beside her rang. She picked it up and saw that it was Tang Yu's number. She pursed her lips and did not dare to take it for a long time. After the ringtone stopped, it started ringing again, one after another. Finally, she picked it up and heard Tang Yu's cold voice. I'm downstairs. Startled, she ran to the balcony with her phone in hand. Looking down, she saw his white sports car, and Tang Yu was leaning against the car door, looking up at her in the dark. In such a dark night, his black eyes were like a small cluster of flames, so deep and serene that it made her afraid. Come down. His voice was tense. Pei Chi-Chi did not know why she went down and why she was like a lamb in a tiger's mouth. She only knew that if she did not go down, he would not let her go. She ran downstairs in only her home clothes. When she reached the first floor, she saw him and unconsciously slowed down, walking slowly towards him. Tang Yu put down his phone and stood there, watching her attentively. Her heart was beating fast. She had a feeling that Tang Yu knew something. Chapter 396. She slowly walked towards him, walking towards the love of her life in the strong night wind. Perhaps, after tonight, they would never meet like this again. Every step was an extreme form of death by 1,000 cuts. Every step was a replay of their past. Tang Yu leaned against the front of the car and waited quietly for her to walk towards him. Finally, she walked in front of him and looked up. She was almost frozen by his cold breath. Tang Yu. She had just started to speak when he reached out and grabbed her slender arm. The world spun around her as she was pushed against the car. Then, her little mouth was covered by his cold lips, and they were kissing each other. She was stunned for a moment and then subconsciously wanted to resist. However, when she tried to move, he pressed her against the car and kissed her fiercely. Her body was pressed down by him, and he used a strength that almost crushed her. His lips were cold at first, but then they became hot, so hot that she almost jumped up. She grabbed his shoulder and tried to push him away. He simply raised her hand high above her head, and with one hand, he started to rudely pull her clothes with the other. In the midst of the coolness, Pei Chi then realized what he was trying to do. Tang Yu, this is outside. Her voice was swallowed by his mouth and crushed into pieces. At this moment, he seemed to have lost his mind. His dark eyes were stained with a trace of red, and there was a hidden power in them that wanted to tear her apart. Pei Chi looked at him and was stunned. The two of them looked at each other, both panting. She had just opened her mouth when he suddenly turned her body around and pressed her against the car. He covered her from behind. Pei Chi, if I could, I also want to give up on you. He covered her tightly and whispered in her ear. His tone was filled with anger and unwillingness. Pei Chi was almost flattened by him. She was so scared that she did not dare to move. Tang Yu pulled her hair and forced her to look at him. That gaze made her tremble. Then he opened the car door, threw her in, and got into the car himself. Pei Chi wanted to get out of the car, but he had already started the car. Pei Chi, if you dare to move again, I can't guarantee what I will do. His voice was very cold, as if he was about to freeze ice beads. She stared blankly at him for a while before asking softly, "Where are we going?" He didn't say anything and sped up. She seemed to have realized something. Her heart was pounding, and her breathing was chaotic. She looked ahead and said in a hoarse voice, "Tang Yu, if there is no end in front of us, we can keep going, but it would not be without an end. The road would eventually come to an end, and they would eventually part ways." He pursed his lips and did not speak. Pei Chi didn't dare to say anything else. The car drove for more than 20 minutes before it entered the Xia City district. The engine was off, but Tang Yu didn't move. His voice was a little cold. "Pei Chi, don't you have anything to say to me?" Her breathing was erratic as she turned her head to look at him. Tang Yu was the same. Their eyes met. He was still filled with anger and indignation. Yes, of course, he was unwilling. She gave up on him easily because she was Zhaoke's daughter. She thought that this was the best outcome. She was relieved because she didn't feel sorry for anyone. But what about him? What about him? "Pei Chi, if you want to leave, you have to leave my things behind," he said coldly. Chapter 397. His large palm covered her heart, and his voice was a little hoarse. "Here, take my heart." Her heartbeat sped up not only because of where he was holding her, but also because of his words. He held her as if he was holding her heart, and she couldn't breathe. Pei Chi wanted to say something, but he had already opened the car door and dragged her out from the other side. She screamed, but she couldn't stop him. He seemed to have gone crazy. He dragged her all the way to the apartment in Xia City. The door was closed, and her body was pressed against the door. Tang Yu hugged her from behind. Rather than saying that he was hugging her, it was more like he was trapping her. Everything happened too quickly. On this night, it was like a storm. It was mixed with anger, and it continued as if it didn't know fatigue. Messy, sweaty, painful. Her pain could no longer move him. Just like that, they were entangled. After a long time, it finally calmed down. He was still behind her, holding her slender waist to stop her from slipping down. On the ground, there were their jackets, shirts, and underwear stacked together. It looked incomparably alluring. For the entire night, he didn't even have the mood to change his posture. Once it calmed down, she felt a little cold, and it hurt when she moved. But as soon as she moved, he pressed her harder and bit her small, white shoulder. "Tang Yu." Her voice was a little floaty and hoarse. "Let go of me. I have to go back." Just as she finished speaking, his large palm on her waist moved to her heart. He squeezed hard, and she couldn't help but cry out, "Pei Chi, before I think about it, you're not allowed to go anywhere." His voice was as deep as dripping water. Pei Chi was in a daze again. After a long time, she came back to her senses. Her voice was even more floaty than her body. "You know?" Tang Yu didn't say anything. He just hugged her, letting his body and heart become as heavy as water. "Tang Xian is at home alone," she said with difficulty. But it was better if she didn't say it. The moment she said it, it was like a storm. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and fainted, her body slipping to the ground. Tang Yu ended it quickly and simply, then carried her to the bedroom. After covering her with the blanket, he took a quick shower, put on his bathrobe, and sat by the side smoking. Dawn had already arrived, but there was still a trace of darkness in the depths of his heart that had yet to awaken. Just like that, he smoked his cigarette and looked at Pei Chi-Chi's sleeping face. She was probably exhausted and had fallen into a deep sleep. He also knew that he didn't have any priorities today. She almost fell apart from the impact. His expression was so unfathomable that it was almost painful. He too had his struggles and difficulties. However, he had never thought of giving up on her, or destruction, or take it by force. Regardless of her wishes, he would always keep her by his side. Accidents always happened, and this accident was that Tang Xian was not his sister. The accident was that Zhao Ku would drag Pei Chi-Chi into the water without a care for anything else. In other words, she couldn't hide her identity for long. Tang Yu smoked a few cigarettes. When Pei Chi-Chi coughed, he put out the cigarette. Then, he held his forehead and chuckled. His chuckle was a little bitter. What was the point of thinking so much? Anyway, he would not let go of her. Chapter 398. When Pei Chi-Chi woke up, she found herself in a familiar yet strange room. Is this the rose garden? She sat up abruptly and looked around. Why did Tang Yu bring her here? He clearly knew about her identity. She thought of the chance encounter at the night bar. It seemed that it wasn't a chance encounter. He had suspected her for a long time. Her heart turned cold. At that moment, the door was pushed open. She thought it was Tang Yu, but when she looked up, it was Tang Xian. Tang Xian ran over and jumped onto the bed like a kitten. She lay beside Pei Chi-Chi and looked at her adorably. Chi-Chi, are you hungry? As soon as she said that, Pei Chi-Chi felt that she was indeed hungry. What time is it? Her voice was a little hoarse. Tang Xian coughed softly. It's 3 in the afternoon. Brother hasn't come back yet. Get up, the chef here made a lot of delicious snacks. Pei Chi-Chi sat up. She was only wearing a white nightgown that slid down her shoulders. Her long black hair draped over her shoulders, giving her a delicate beauty. She was about to speak when Tang Yu's voice came from the door. Tang Xian, go downstairs and have some snacks. Tang Xian looked at Pei Chi-Chi, hoping that she would say something for her. However, Pei Chi-Chi couldn't even protect herself, so she didn't dare to say anything. Tang Xian nodded, got off the bed dejectedly and ran out. Tang Yu walked in and closed the door behind him. He was holding a tray in his hand with a light meal on it. Seeing that Pei Chi-Chi was still sitting, he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and leaned against it. The tray was on the table. He looked at her. Aren't you going to get up to eat? His voice was very cold. He didn't seem to be the same person as the crazy man last night. Pei Chi-Chi was a little dazed. She raised her little face and looked at him. Her voice was like a cat's meow. Why do you have to do this? Pei Chi-Chi, then tell me, what should I do? Tang Yu looked straight into her fragile eyes. Run away and separate like you? Or should I tell you that the one I love is not you? Huh? Do you want to do this? You want me to be with other women, to do what you do, to indulge myself in her unclothed body? His voice was harsh. Pei Chi-Chi was in a daze. As expected, he knew everything. She pursed her lips and suddenly lifted the blanket to get out of bed. Her hair was loose, and she was dressed in white. She was dressed in white and had black hair. She was so beautiful that she was the cleanest color in the world. Tang Yu, you and I both know it's impossible. How can I face your mother? My mother hurt her that way for herself. There was also Jinrong. He hasn't woken up yet, and maybe he never will. As she spoke, tears streamed down her cheeks. Tang Yu, how can I face Tang Xian? You know it. She couldn't stop retreating. As she retreated, she screamed at him, Tang Yu, we can't do this. The person I can't be with the most is you. After she said that, she took a deep breath. Her expression was a little cold. Yes, we shouldn't be together. She would feel guilty. She didn't dare to see Lin Yun. She didn't dare to see the Lin family. She didn't even dare to do those things with Tang Yu, because if she were to get pregnant in the future, she would be afraid to see Lin Yun. This was the reality. It was a reality that she couldn't get over. A prince and Cinderella had always been a fairy tale. Yes, I know, he said firmly and heartlessly. I know you will be in pain, but Pei-Chi-Chi, am I not in pain? Chapter 399. He grabbed her wrist with one hand and said, Pei-Chi-Chi, you're not the only one in pain. Pei-Chi-Chi was stunned. So, stay where you are and don't go anywhere. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that you'll lose anything else. He bent down, and his cold breath brushed against her lips. Pei-Chi-Chi could feel that he was angry. Rather than angry, he was actually furious. He hated Zhao Ku, so how could he not be angry with her? Closing his eyes, he spat out, "Why?" He straightened his body and looked down at her. He sneered and said mockingly, Pei-Chi-Chi, you're asking me why? He reached out to pinch her little chin and slowly lowered his head. Looking into her eyes, he said slowly, I really want to see your heart. Her beautiful chin was forced to tilt up as she looked up at him. After a while, she laughed softly, and it sounded a little sad. Yes, I don't have a heart. I was born that way. I'm cold and selfish, and I don't know how to love anyone. Then do you dare to say that you don't love me? He pushed her against the floor-to-ceiling window. The transparent glass was so clean that it seemed as if it didn't exist. She was pushed there, and she had the fear that she would fall at any moment. Let go of me, she called out weakly, like a kitten, but he was unmoved. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her mercilessly. Pei-Chi-Chi, if you dare to lie, I promise I'll throw you down from here. He stared at her with a burning gaze, and there were some sparks in his eyes. She didn't know that her pajamas had slid down to her waist, and she looked extremely seductive. He really wanted to lower his head and kiss her, but he was too angry to do so. Pei-Chi-Chi was forced by him. She turned her head away, and there was a hint of vulnerability and stubbornness in her voice. I don't love you. As soon as she said that, he kissed her roughly. His thin lips pressed against hers mercilessly, and he used so much force that her lips almost broke. Her back hurt from the glass. She didn't dare to struggle, for fear that she would fall if she moved. When he finally finished kissing her, he looked up at her and asked, What about now? Pei-Chi-Chi was still looking away, panting helplessly like a little animal. After a long time, she turned her head and looked at him with her watery eyes. I don't love you. Tang Yu kissed her again. This time, not only did he kiss her, but he also tortured her with his palm. Pei-Chi-Chi screamed. Then, she felt that her body wasn't her own anymore. She lowered her head helplessly and looked at Tang Yu. She could not see his face, only his black hair. She had never imagined that he would do such a thing to her. Her little hand landed on his hair and pulled it up forcefully. It was so painful, but he still didn't let her go. Pei-Chi-Chi's body softened, and she finally half-knelt in front of him. The hair on her forehead was soaked with sweat, and she stared at him in a daze. Her body didn't feel like it belonged to her anymore. It was soft and had no strength at all. He knelt face to face with her, and he lifted her chin with one hand. Pei-Chi-Chi, do you still dare to say that you don't love me? She closed her eyes, and there was a tinge of heartbreak in them. We will go to hell. He was still holding her chin, and he stared at her with a burning gaze. After a long time, he said softly, Even if I go to hell, I will take you with me. Pei-Chi-Chi was stunned. Tang Yu carried her and walked to the bathroom. She was already a mess. Chapter 400. Even though Tang Yu had ordered his men not to talk about it in front of Tang Xian, Tang Xian still saw the news about Zhao Ku. Actually, it wasn't Zhao Ku, but Tang Ziyuan. He was interviewed by the media. In the news report, Tang Ziyuan was very impatient in front of the camera, his face full of anxiety. This was because they found Ronglei's sperm in Zhao Ku's body. This was something that could not be denied. No matter how much Tang Ziyuan cared about Tang Xian, he had no choice but to divorce Zhao Ku. Tang Xian stared blankly, her voice soft. Daddy doesn't want mommy anymore. She looked at the camera. Tang Ziyuan's face was cold. I will ask my lawyer to apply for a divorce with Ms. Zhao. A large pile of wheat was squeezed in front of him. Mr. Tang, Will you hire a lawyer for your wife? After all, you are the only one she can rely on. Even if she betrays you, will you still consider the relationship between husband and wife? Tang Ziyuan's face was a little dark. He paused for a moment, then said, "Of course." With that, he got into the black limousine and the camera switched to the host. Tang Xian was in a daze. Mommy killed someone? Mommy betrayed Daddy? Tang Yu came out and saw Tang Xian's pale face. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately carried Tang Xian, pressed a few times on her philtrum, and patted her little face. Tang Xian was still panting a few times. After a while, she came back to her senses. Her face went from pale to green, then from green to white. She curled up in Tang Yu's arms like a kitten, crying her heart out. "Brother, why would my mother kill someone? She has never even killed a chick." Tang Yu didn't say a word. He just hugged Tang Xian. Tang Xian's tears stained his chest. It was wet and hot. It was very uncomfortable. He felt very complicated. He had treated Tang Xian as a sister for a long time, but now he knew that she was not related to him by blood, and she was also Zhaoke's child. Tang Yu didn't hesitate at all. He still treated her as a sister. The only love he had for Tang Xian was to keep the secret that she was not Tang Ziyuan's child. But he loved and hated Chi-Chi at the same time. He couldn't let it go, and he was annoyed. That sour and painful feeling. He himself could not explain it. His large palm comforted Tang Xian. Tang Xian raised her head and asked him with tears in her eyes, "Brother, will you save Mommy? Can you ask Dad not to divorce Mom?" Tang Yu reached out and stroked her fluffy hair. His voice was a little low. "This is an adult's decision. I can't change it." "Will Mommy go to jail?" Tang Xian bit her lip. She wanted to cry again. Tang Yu sighed in his heart. He didn't answer, but he reached out and caressed Tang Xian's head. Because that answer was too cruel to Tang Xian. Tang Xian looked at Tang Yu pitifully with her big, watery eyes. She knew that she shouldn't have asked her brother to save her mother, because her mother had wronged Auntie and her brother. Tang Yu comforted her, his heart heavy. He looked up and saw Pei Chi-Chi standing at the door of the bedroom. She held onto the door, her face pale. His eyes locked with hers. They both knew in their hearts that no matter how much her heart ached for Tang Xian, Pei Chi-Chi would do it. Pei Chi-Chi looked at Tang Xian and saw her crying. It reminded her of her childhood. Chapter 401. Tang Yu stared at her for a long time before he said, "Stay here and take care of Tang Xian. I'm going out for a bit." He walked out and Pei Chi-Chi sat down beside Tang Xian. Tang Xian hugged her immediately. Chi-Chi. Her hands were tightly wrapped around Tang Xian's. Pei Chi-Chi had an indescribable feeling in her heart. She hesitated for a long time before she put her hand on Tang Xian's shoulder and gently patted it. Tang Xian was still sobbing. After a while, she looked up at Pei Chi-Chi and said pitifully, "Chi-Chi, I want to see Mom." Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips and did not say anything. Tang Xian's expression was firm. Even if Mom did those things, even if Dad doesn't want Mom anymore, she's still my mom. After she finished speaking, Pei Chi-Chi's heart felt a little wet. Yes, no matter how bad Zhaoku was, she was still Tang Xian's mother. What about her? She and Zhaoku were destined to die. She reached out and touched Tang Xian's cheek. "I'll ask your brother in a few days." If it was for herself, she would not have begged Tang Yu. But seeing Tang Xian in such pain, she was willing to let her see Zhaoku one last time. Tang Xian was sad for the whole afternoon. When Tang Yu came back, it was already 9 o'clock at night. When he came back, he looked a little tired. Looking at Pei Chi-Chi, he asked calmly, "Where's Tang Xian?" "Asleep." Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips and said softly, "I have something to ask of you." Tang Yu looked at her for a long time. He took off his jacket and threw it on the sofa. He unbuttoned 2 more buttons and asked calmly, "What is it?" "Tang Xian wants to see Zhaoku." Pei Chi-Chi hesitated for a while before saying. Tang Yu looked at her deeply. "Is it because of you, or because of Tang Xian?" "For Tang Xian," she said honestly. Tang Yu stood up and walked towards the dining room. His tone was indifferent. "She's my sister. If she were to beg me, She would ask for it herself. Pei Chi, you're the one begging me. What's going on? Naturally, he prepared to eat. Seeing her standing there, he stared at her. Aren't you going to eat? Pei Chi sat down awkwardly. Before she could say anything, he spoke first. Pei Chi, you care about Tang Xian a lot, don't you? Her heart shuddered. She probably guessed what he wanted to say. She pursed her lips and looked straight into his eyes. If you don't want Tang Xian to know the truth, I think you'll cooperate. His voice was cold. Pei Chi was annoyed. Tang you bastard. Not nearly as good as you, he said coldly. There had never been anyone who could put him in such a difficult position. What do you want? She looked at him, her eyes guarded. Actually, she was not that naive to think that Tang Yu would ignore the fact that she was Zhao Ke's daughter just because he loved her. This was a fact that could not be changed. It would also be a hurdle in his heart that he could not get over. If he did not care, then he would not be Tang Yu. Pei Chi clearly knew how close he was to his mother. Tang Yu only pursed his lips and did not say anything. Pei Chi did not dare to ask more. She really had no appetite, and she was worried about Tang Xian, so she only ate a few mouthfuls. Tang Yu looked at her with an indecipherable expression. After the meal, he stood up and said, I'll ask Uncle Zhao to send you back. She was stunned and looked up at him. Tang Yu's expression was cold. In that instant, she knew that he cared a lot about her. Chapter 402. She looked up and suddenly called out to him. Her voice was a little hoarse. Tang Yu, let's forget about it. At that moment, he had already reached the staircase. Hearing that, he paused and looked in her direction. His face was so gloomy that it could drip water. He looked at her quietly and said coldly, Forget about it or not. Pei Chi, it's not up to you to decide. When did he not want to let go of her? When did he not want to let go? When did he not want to end things here? He knew his mother's hatred for Zhao Ke. He knew how guilty and regretful she felt for losing her child. So even though he loved Tang Xian dearly, he never showed it in front of his mother. If he were to be with Pei Chi, he would let his mother down. But he couldn't bear to part with her. By marrying Pei Chi, even if he didn't need to be with his mother all the time, this matter of status was enough to make his mother uncomfortable and uncomfortable. Pei Chi could only understand a little of his complicated feelings. They looked at each other for a long time. He walked upstairs while she stood there. She didn't know what to do. She felt like she had nowhere to go. She raised her head and watched Tang Yu walk up the stairs. He was as noble as ever. She looked up at him and pursed her lips. Tang Yu walked upstairs and saw Tang Xian sleeping. After watching for a while, he slowly sat down and reached out to pat Tang Xian's head. She was still so young and sick. Even if she was Zhao Ke's daughter, he couldn't hate her. From the moment he saw this little pink dumpling, he had firmly believed that she was his sister, a blood relative. But she wasn't. She was a child who had nothing to do with him. But her illness was still there. She was still so weak. Zhao Ke might go to jail for the rest of her life. And he couldn't bear to see Tang Xian like that. Just be my little sister forever, he muttered in a low voice, his fingers lightly touching her somewhat cold little face. After sitting for a while, he heard the sound of a car starting up. He knew that Pei Chi had left. He let her go because he hadn't thought it through. He had always been resolute and decisive, but this time, he really could not make up his mind. He had not thought of what he should do with her. However, he knew that he was unwilling to let go of her. Walking to the balcony and looking down at the lights, the black limousine slowly drove out of the manor. He was wearing a gray sweater and stood there watching. The beautiful white curtains wrapped around half of his body, making him look a little unstable. Tang Xian woke up. When she opened her eyes, she couldn't find anyone. She looked around and finally saw Tang Yu's back. She ran over barefooted and hugged Tang Yu from behind. Her voice was like that of a kitten. Brother. His body stiffened. Then he hugged her back. Tang Xian. Tang Xian laid on his chest and cried, like a puppy crying for its mother. There was nothing he could do. The car that had already left turned back. Pei Chi got out of the car. She had forgotten something. But when she opened the car door and looked up, she saw Tang Yu hugging Tang Xian. His fingers were stroking Tang Xian's head. It looked very warm. She was a little envious of Tang Xian. He had touched her like this before. But now, his feelings for her had become complicated. She could understand it, just like how she couldn't accept it herself. Pei Chi looked up at them. In the night wind, she saw them hugging. Chapter 403. She looked at them hugging. It was the warmth that she longed for, but it was something that she could not touch. She was afraid that if she touched it, she would not be able to let go. Pei Chi's lips curled into a faint but cold smile. She could not choose her family background. Even love was out of her control. Jinrong, Tang Yu envied Tang Xian. Tang Xian could stay by Tang Yu's side forever. Even if she was his sister, it would be great. The strong night wind brushed against her face, but she did not feel cold. He just watched them hug each other. Tang Yu saw her too. He did not make a sound, nor did he push Tang Xian away. His dark eyes stared at her coldly. Pei Chi, are you feeling uncomfortable now? Because I hugged Tang Xian, not you. I didn't comfort you at a time like this. Instead, I made things difficult for you. Yes, he made things difficult for her. Because he was also angry and unwilling. He vented all of these on her. Even though he knew that she was innocent, he still did it because he knew that if he did not do it, she would fly away in an instant. The cold night sky, his cold face, and her cold heart. Finally, she entered the living room to get her things. When she walked out, the darkness covered her figure, and finally, she blended into the darkness. Tang Yu raised his chin slightly, and his face was tense. Tang Xian cried in his arms. She was drowsy and called him brother a few times before she closed her eyes and fell asleep. Tang Yu carried her back to the bedroom and sat beside her to watch her. Tang Xian had been sick for many years. She needed a suitable bone marrow. At this moment, he was angry at Zhao Ke. Zhao Ke must have known that Pei Chi was his child, but she did not care about Tang Xian's life for her own selfish reasons. She even wanted to kill Pei Chi. In this world, no one's bone marrow could save Tang Xian. What kind of heartless mother was this? What a twisted personality. Tang Yu looked at Tang Xian's little face. At this moment, she looked very similar to Pei Chi. He reached out and touched her little face. His voice was a little hoarse. I won't abandon you. I don't want Chi either. After a while, seeing that she was fine, he walked out and made a call to Ming Qingqing. Arrange for Tang Xian to meet Zhao Ke. It was late at night. Meng Qingcheng was stunned when he received the call. Tang Yu still had the mood to do this? Didn't he hate Zhao Ke the most? However, he quickly thought of that pitiful Tang Xian. He pursed his lips and sighed. Although he already had some answers in his heart, he didn't want to think in that direction. Tang Yu hung up the phone and looked up at the boundless night outside. He had indulged everyone, but he still loved Tang Xian as if she was his own sister. Even Zhao Ke, he did not kill her. He could only be cruel to the little thing he loved deeply. He didn't even know why he was treating her like this. Chapter 404. Before going to see Zhao Ke, Tang Xian made a trip home. It was her own request. She wanted to see her father. She wanted to ask him if he really didn't want her anymore. Tang Yu drove the car to Yanhui and waited in the car while Tang Xian ran in. Tang Ziyuan was sitting on the sofa. He didn't do anything. He just sat there. Daddy. Tang Xian looked at him with tears in her eyes. She threw herself into Tang Zun's arms and cried, Daddy, don't divorce Mommy, okay? Save Mommy. I don't want to be a motherless child. Tang Xian hugged Tang Ziyuan tightly and begged, I can't live for long. I can't live without Mommy. Tang Ziyuan couldn't bear to see her like this. He reached out and patted Tang Xian. You don't understand adult matters. Tang Xian looked up and blinked her teary eyes. She pursed her lips tightly, and after a while, she begged, I understand, Daddy, I understand. Please, I beg you, save Mommy. Even if Daddy can't be with Mommy in the future, I beg you, please save her. In Tang Xian's heart, Zhao Ke had always been beautiful. She couldn't imagine Zhao Ku in prison. Her mother had always been a rich woman. Why would she go to prison? Would she not be able to see her mother in the future? Perhaps, when her mother was released from prison, she would die of illness. Tang Ziyuan felt bad when Tang Xian cried. He patted her and said, "Be a good girl. Daddy will try his best." It was just that there was no way for him and Zhao Ku to continue their relationship as husband and wife. He was a man with a reputation. Zhao Ku's cuckold was too big for him. The forensics team had determined that Zhao Ku's DNA matched Ronglei's. That meant that they had an illicit relationship before Ronglei died. How could Tang Ziyuan tolerate that? He felt disgusted just thinking about it. But he wouldn't tell this to his daughter. He reached out and patted her head. Tang Xian raised her head and asked tearfully, "Really?" Tang Ziyuan forced a smile. "When have I ever lied to you?" His heart was a little wet. Looking at Tang Xian's face reminded him of Zhao Ku. Actually, it wasn't that he didn't have good times with Zhao Ku. At that time, Zhao Ku was young, cute, and beautiful. There were many men who wanted to own her, and he had unintentionally done it with her. At that time, he was a little remorseful. After all, he had let his wife down. However, he was still obsessed with her youthful body and superb skills. The feeling of being with Zhao Ku was completely different from being with Yun Yun. It was a crazy and taboo relationship. He was so infatuated that he forgot that he was deeply in love with Lin Yun. He had forgotten that he was also a father. He had let down Tang Yu, so he had always spoiled Tang Xian and could not bear to see her sad. Tang Xian felt a little better, but she didn't know that Zhao Ku's matter wasn't that easy to settle. Even if he didn't spend the rest of his life in prison, he would have to spend at least 10 years there. Tang Ziyuan sent Tang Xian back to the car. He knew that Tang Xian was going to see Zhao Ku later. It's good to meet them. After all, they are mother and daughter, Tang Ziyuan thought. He opened the car door and looked at Tang Yu. "I have something to say to you." Tang Yu glanced at Tang Xian, who was in the back seat. He opened the car door and walked away with Tang Ziyuan. Chapter 405. I've never thought that way. Whether she's good or bad has nothing to do with me, Tang Yu said indifferently. Tang Ziyuan sighed again. After a long while, he said softly, "I know you still blame me." Even now, he felt that he was reaping what he sowed, and that Zhao Ku deserved it. He had given her the title of Mrs. Tang, but she had repaid him like this. Tang Ziyuan sighed in his heart. He couldn't describe his feelings. He looked at his son and couldn't bring himself to say that excessive request. He wanted to start over with Lin Yun, but it was just a dream in the past. After what happened with Zhao Ku, he felt that it was better to be a first wife. Compared to Zhao Ku's frivolous and casual nature, Lin Yun was very loyal. He believed that Lin Yun hadn't had a man all these years because she couldn't forget him. Thinking of this, Tang Ziyuan felt much better. He let out a long sigh. "Comfort Tang Xian." Tang Yu looked at him and mocked. "As a father, shouldn't you be the one doing this?" Tang Ziyuan said helplessly, "Yes." He was getting further and further away from his son. Tang Ziyuan felt a little lonely because he had no one to talk to after such a big thing happened. Tang Yu smiled faintly and walked to his car. He closed the door and drove out of Tang Ziyuan's sight. Tang Xian sat next to Tang Yu and looked at Tang Yu anxiously. She said softly, "Brother, will you go in with me later?" Tang Yu looked ahead and said in a low voice, "Yes." The car slowly slid to the side of the road. He took out his phone and dialed Pei Chi-Chi's number. "I'll wait for you by the side of the road." Tang Xian looked at him. "Is it Chi-Chi?" Tang Yu said faintly, "Yes." "She's going to do something else. Bring her along." There were some things that he wouldn't say to Tang Xian. She was still young and didn't need to know. Tang Xian nodded and put her head to the side, feeling a little disappointed. 5 minutes later, Pei Chi-Chi came over, opened the back door, and sat down. Tang Yu looked at her in the rearview mirror and didn't say anything. He just quietly started the car. They didn't speak much along the way. Only Tang Xian would sneak a peek at Tang Yu from time to time with tears in her eyes. Until now, the little guy had not given up the idea of asking her brother to save her mother. She knew that as long as her brother could think of a way, her mother would definitely be able to come out. However, Tang Xian knew her limits, so she didn't say anything else. It was silent in the car, and it was drizzling outside. Everyone's mood was foggy, and it was hard to describe what they were feeling. Finally, they arrived. Pei Chi got out of the car and smiled faintly. "I'll be leaving first." Tang Xian's mouth twitched, and she couldn't help but call out to Chi. Pei Chi hesitated for a while, but she still walked over and patted Tang Xian's head. "Tang Xian, be good." Tang Xian bit her lip and looked at her pitifully. "Chi, where are you going?" Pei Chi smiled faintly. "I'm going to meet a friend that I haven't seen for a long time." Tang Xian was a little surprised. She looked around and asked softly, "Did she make a mistake too?" Pei Chi nodded. "Yes, she made a mistake too, and she might not be able to come out again." Tang Xian's eyes were a little red. She thought of Zhaoku again. Pei Chi didn't say much and left quickly. Chapter 406. Tang Yu looked in Pei Chi's direction with a profound gaze. After a long time, he said to Tang Xian, "Let's go." Tang Xian let out a pitiful "oh" and followed behind Tang Yu. A well-dressed man in uniform received them. He looked at Tang Yu and Tang Xian. Then, the man spoke respectfully to Tang Yu and brought them to a small guest room. Zhaoku came out in her usual attire, but she looked a little haggard and different from how she used to be. Of course, this was the result of an accommodation. When she saw Tang Yu and Tang Xian, Zhaoku was stunned for a moment. Then, she sat down and said nothing. The person who brought her here went out and closed the door behind him. Tang Xian couldn't hold it in anymore. She ran to Zhaoku and hugged her with her little arms. She cried loudly, "Mommy." Zhaoku was in a daze when she was hugged so tightly. This was her child, a child that she had raised and raised. She was the one who had almost given up her child for her own wealth. But at a time like this, Tang Xian was the only one who could call her mother and hug her like this. Zhaoku closed her eyes. Her bright and beautiful face was now devoid of any radiance. She lowered her eyes and pressed her face against Tang Xian's. After a while, she raised her head and looked at Tang Yu. She said softly, "You know, don't you?" Tang Yu's gaze was calm. After a long time, he nodded lightly. Zhaoku's eyes were burning with passion. Her voice was trembling slightly. "I beg you, save Tang Xian." Tang Yu looked at the woman in front of him. This woman killed his sister and separated his parents. She didn't even save her own daughter. She killed her. She was selfish to the extreme. Now, she made such a request to him. What a joke. Tang Yu didn't say anything. Zhaoku's face was filled with annoyance. "You're her brother. Is that so?" Tang Yu looked straight at Zhaoku. That cold gaze caused Zhaoku's heart to tremble, and she couldn't help but be stunned. She knew in her heart that Tang Yu knew everything. She covered her face with her chicken claw-like hands and murmured in a low voice, you can't tell anyone. If she told anyone, everything would be over. She would not be able to be Mrs. Tang anymore. She was Tang Ziyuan's wife. No, she wasn't. She had always wanted to be that person's wife, even if it was just a concubine. Zhaoku looked up. Tears and snot were flowing out. She looked extremely pathetic. She loved to look beautiful and couldn't stand her current appearance. But now, she couldn't care less. Frightened, Tang Xian hid behind Tang Yu and looked at her mother warily. How could her mother be like this? Tang Yu knew that Zhaoku was probably poisoned. Now that it was acting up, she must be feeling terrible. Of course, this kind of place couldn't satisfy her. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was a living hell. He looked at her quietly and led Tang Xian to the door. Tang Xian pitifully called out for her mother again. Tang Yu suddenly stopped and said in a calm tone, "No matter what, she's my sister." Zhaoku was stunned. Did Tang Yu mean that he agreed? She was in disbelief and a little miserable. Chapter 407. Zhaoku was still in a daze. The door silently closed and opened again. Her body suddenly froze. She looked up and saw Pei Chi. There was a trace of fear on Zhaoku's face. She shifted her body and looked at Pei Chi. Pei Chi didn't have much of an expression on her face. She looked back into Zhao Ke's eyes. She still remembered the first time she met Zhao Ke. Zhao Ke was very glamorous. They were people from two different worlds. Now, Zhao Ke and she were also from two different worlds. One was inside the wall, and the other was outside the wall. What are you doing here? Zhao Ke's eyes were guarded. Her body shrank and her face was still very ugly. Are you here to laugh at me? Pei Chi only felt sad. This was her mother, the woman who gave birth to her. She didn't give her any warmth. She even wanted to kill her. Even now, she didn't have a word of comfort. I often wonder if there's a mistake. I'm not your daughter at all. Pei Chi looked at Zhao Ke. She was a little bitter and said with some difficulty. Zhao Ke was in a daze for a moment. She also smiled lightly. Yes, you should be suspicious. No mother would treat themselves like this, right? She supported herself with her hand and looked forward. She stared at Pei Chi's little face. Her smile was a little strange. There was actually a trace of hatred on that dry, yellow face. Do you know why I hate you? It's not because you're Pei Mingyi's child. But why do you look like this? If you were uglier, I wouldn't hate you so much. Zhao Ke's hand slipped. It was as if she had lost the strength to support herself. After a long time, she smiled sadly. You easily got Tang Yu's love. As for me, I have nothing. The man who loves me only likes my body. The man I love doesn't care about me. Pei Chi, my biggest curse to you is that you will never know who your father is. Never know. Zhao Ke laughed almost crazily. That mournful laughter seemed to grab onto people's hearts, causing them to feel terrified. Pei Chi just sat there. She looked at Zhao Ke and lowered her eyes. When she looked at her again, her eyes were cold. I couldn't choose my birth. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting with you. Zhao Ke just stared at her, her face and eyes full of embarrassment. Suddenly, she cried out sharply, It's you, isn't it? Did you do it? Pei Chi was still sitting quietly. Her eyes that were as cold as midnight looked into Zhao Ke's eyes calmly. What about you? What did you do? Do you dare to say that the car accident wasn't caused by you? Yes, Zhao Ke admitted. I did it. She had a crazed look on her face. I was the one who wanted to kill you. I was the one who wanted you to disappear. Pei Chi, if you hadn't appeared, I would have been fine. It was your appearance that ruined everything. Zhao Ke's eyes were wide open. Her eyeballs looked as though they were about to pop out. They were bloodshot and looked very scary. However, Pei Chi was not afraid of her. That was because this woman was pitiful and pitiful. She had harmed herself. Zhao Ke's neck stiffened. After a long while, she said, You're here to collect a debt. Collect a debt. She kept repeating those words. Her expression was a little lifeless. That haggard and pitiful look did not have any of the elegance of the number one beauty of B City back then. Pei Chi left quietly. Her heart was a little cold and a little warm. Chapter 408. Outside, she saw Tang Yu leaning against the car, smoking. When he saw her, he finished the last puff of the cigarette in his hand, threw it on the ground, and stepped on it to extinguish it. Pei Chi walked over, looked up at him and said, I can take a taxi myself? You want to draw a line? His voice was cold, and so was his expression. Pei Chi pursed her lips and said faintly, Tang Yu, I said. He knew what she wanted to say and sneered. I also said that it's up to me whether or not it counts. Her lips moved slightly, and he took a step forward, getting very close to her. He looked down at her, and in an instant, her whole body was enveloped by his scent. He pinched her chin with his fingers, forced her to look up at him, and said coldly, Whether it's pleasure or pain, Pei Chi, you have to bear with it. Probably because he was angry, he let go of her after saying that, turned around, and got into the car, and drove away. In the car, Tang Xian looked at her brother carefully. You're not taking Chi with you? Tang Yu's handsome chin was tight. She doesn't want to go with us. Tang Xian didn't dare to ask again. After a while, she thought of Zhao Ke again, and she was still a little scared. Was that really her mother? She didn't dare to ask, so she curled up her little body, looking very pitiful. Seeing her, Tang Yu thought of Pei Chi. He could have treated her better, but he didn't, because he knew how she felt. She was thinking of running away from him now, and he didn't want to. The car gradually drove away, and Pei Chi looked at it alone and smiled softly. She was always alone. Zhaoka might be sentenced to more than 10 years in prison, and with Zhaoka's character, she might not be able to live for more than 10 years in a place like this. Perhaps this would be the last time they met. She was born a sin, and when she left, it was still a sin. But until now, she had never regretted it. She could be called cold or cold-blooded, but she had never regretted it. Pei Chi bought a bunch of white chrysanthemums and went to the cemetery to see Pei Mingyi. "Dad, do you blame me?" Pei Chi sat beside him, just like when they were children. "Are you blaming me for sending the love of your life to prison, and in such an unbearable way?" She leaned her head against the tombstone and smiled. "But Dad, there is not only love in this world, but there is also more hate. You love her so much, but she hates me so much." She just wanted to seek justice for Jinrong, for herself, and for Lin Yun, even if it was her mother. Of it, "Daddy, I thought I would be very happy. But after doing all this, I won't be." Chi raised her head. "She never thought of hugging me." Pei Mingyi, of course, could not answer her. He could only lie there quietly. Pei Chi didn't say anything else. She just leaned against him and sat there for a very, very long time. It was so long that her nose was red from the cold and her body was cold. When she returned, she fell ill. So, the moving of the Pei group was almost handled by her secretary, Xiao Wan. When necessary, she would give her a call. The new company was in a building in the suburbs, and the annual rent was settled at 500,000. It had been tidied up, and the sign was ready. All that was left was to move. Everything seemed to have calmed down. After she recovered from the cold, it was also the day she was going to move. She arrived at the Pei group early in the morning. Chapter 409. Pei Chi stood in the office, feeling a little disappointed. This place was founded by her father. Pei Corporation had been here for so many years, through ups and downs, but she had sold this piece of land. She had used this money to buy back 30% of Pei Corporation's shares. At that moment, she held 60% of the shares in her hands and had control of the structure. "Dad, I believe you won't blame me because if I didn't sell this piece of land, I would be walking on thin ice all the time." Pei Corporation could also change owners at any time. Little Win's voice came from the door. "Boss Pei, it's time." Pei Chi grunted indifferently and turned around to walk outside with Xiao Wan. She looked at the empty company and pursed her lips. "Let's go." Little Win comforted her. "Boss Pei, this is good for the company. Now that we have billions of working capital, we can do more things. It is also very beneficial for the company's development." Of course, Pei Chi knew that. She just smiled faintly. Just as she was about to walk out, footsteps came from the door. It was getting closer and finally stopped at the door. Pei Chi looked up and was stunned. As for Xiaowan, she covered her mouth and couldn't say anything for a long time. Oh my God, it was Mr. Tang. Tang Yu was not alone. Meng Qingqing and 2 lawyers were behind him. Meng Qingqing's expression was rather strange and helpless. He felt that Tang Yu had too much money to burn. Buying the Pei Corporation's building was probably the biggest failure of Xing Yuan's investment in recent years. He spent 20 billion yuan and returned the building to them. In the end, didn't he just spend 20 billion yuan to sleep with Pei Chi? Meng Qingcheng wanted to wipe his tears. His annual salary was only 20 to 30 million yuan. He also wanted to be reborn as a woman. At that time, he would not have to work so hard and be threatened by the unscrupulous boss to dig in Africa. He smiled at Pei Chi and said, "Little Chi, this is good news. A pie has fallen from the sky." Tang Yu glanced at him. "Qingqing, is this how you usually negotiate with others?" Meng Qingqing said in a low voice, "Xiaoqi is not someone else." He even stretched out his cute little paw towards Pei Chi. Pei Chi was a little speechless. Tang Yu's arrival was definitely not a good thing. Sure enough, Tang Yu looked at her and said lightly, "Are there any chairs in the conference room?" Little one immediately nodded. Yes, yes. Pei Chi followed them in, stupefied. She was still a little confused. As they sat down, Tang Yu's tone was indifferent. "Miss Pei, you might not know this, but there's a clause in the land contract I bought." He turned to look at Meng Qingcheng. Meng Qingcheng sighed in his heart. "If you want to pick up girls, you have to call me over." How could such a shameful thing be done in such a cold and heartless manner? Meng Qingcheng coughed lightly. "Let's discuss this contract again." Pei Chi looked up. "Is there a problem with the contract? Wasn't it confirmed a long time ago?" Moreover, the money was already in his hands. Meng Qingcheng chuckled. Indeed, Pei Chi did not know anything. Tang Yu's tricks were really deep. He pulled his tie and pushed the page of the contract in front of Pei Chi. "Boss Pei, it's written very clearly here. The condition for buying this building is that the Pei Corporation still has to operate in this building. Otherwise, this deal will be invalid." Chapter 410. Pei Chi reached out to take it and looked at it carefully. There was no mistake. That was what was written on the contract, and it was signed by her. How could this be? She looked at Xiaowen in shock, but Xiaowen was also at a loss. The two rookies looked at each other for a long time before Pei Chi said, "Thank you for your kind intentions, Mr. Tang. I think the Pei Corporation should be self-reliant." Does the Pei Corporation want to be self-reliant, or does Boss Pei want to be self-reliant? Tang Yu suddenly said with a hint of mockery in his voice. Pei Chi was a little hurt. She pursed her lips and stared at him for a long time without saying anything. Meng Qingqing said lazily, "Then Boss Pei should communicate with our President Tang." He gave the lawyers behind him a look, and they were about to leave with him. Little one was confused and hadn't come back to her senses yet. Mr. Tang spent 20 billion yuan, and that was it? He was too capricious because he was rich. Meng Qingqing carried little one away like a chick and considerately closed the door for Tang Yu and Pei Chi. He looked at the door and felt like he was in the bridal chamber. Inside the door, Tang Yu looked at Pei Chi and said calmly, "Do you think that you can completely get rid of me if you leave here?" "I didn't think so." Pei Chi turned her face away and looked out of the window. "I will never forget Mr. Tang's help." He stared into her eyes and leaned back. Then, he smiled coldly. "Pei Chi, is this how you will never forget?" He stretched out his long arm and held her little face with his fingers. He stared into her eyes. "I said that you are not allowed to go anywhere before I think about it." Pei Chi was frozen by the coldness in his eyes. She was stunned for a moment and suddenly hit his hand. She stood up and took a few steps back, looking at him defensively. "If your decision is to banish me, will I have to leave obediently at that time? Tang Yu, is that what you mean?" He tensed his jaw and looked at her. He didn't deny the possibility. Pei Chi laughed. She raised her head and tried her best to hold back her tears. "Look, Tang Yu, you can't even make a decision right now. You can't even convince yourself. Do you think I'll wait for this hopeless relationship? Will you wait here to be abandoned? How do you know that I will definitely abandon you?" He sat and looked at her somewhat frantic expression. Her appearance made his heart ache, but at the same time, he felt some pleasure. Yes, pleasure. Seeing her in pain, he felt happy. He felt that she cared about him. Pervert. Pei Chi looked down and chuckled. "Tang Yu, let's not lie to ourselves." She looked straight into his eyes. "Our separation is the best ending." Tang Yu's eyes turned cold. They were very, very cold, as though there was a layer of ice in them. He narrowed his eyes and said after a long time, "Pei Chi, if this is your decision, I will respect it, but—" He slowly stood up and walked to her. She instinctively wanted to run, but he reached out and pulled her into his arms. He hugged her back to back. His arms were like iron pincers that held her waist tightly, and the strength he used made her feel extreme pain. But he didn't soften at all. He still held her waist, and his thin lips pressed against her little neck. His scorching breath blew on her soft neck, causing her to tremble. Even her little head was pulled back by her hair. Chapter 411. His thin lips were on her little neck, as though he could bite off her little neck at any time. Pei Chi, since that's the case, I won't stand on ceremony then. With that said, he bit down on her artery. It wasn't a deep bite, but it was enough to make her tremble. Tang Yu. Her voice was extremely weak and helpless. Being hugged by him like that, he could do whatever he wanted to her, and do whatever he wanted. And indeed, Tang Yu did it. Pei Chi wailed and called out his name uncontrollably. Tang Yu, don't do this, or don't stop. His voice was extremely low and hoarse as it was right beside her ear. With every word he said, she felt as though she was going to die. He had the intention to torture her in such a place, in such a shameful place, in the conference room. Pei Chi bit her lip, not wanting to let out such an embarrassing sound. She cried out angrily, Tang Yu, you bastard. I don't mind being even more of a bastard. He tortured her even more. Perhaps it was because of the anger in his heart, he did not go easy on her and hurt her. Pei Chi screamed and struggled, but she could not stop him. That shameful posture made her feel extremely ashamed. She sounded like she was about to cry. Tang Yu, what are you trying to do? He must have gone crazy. His thin lips were right beside her ear, and his voice was low and hoarse. Boss Pei, tell me. She was almost crazy as she laid on his palm. After a long time, she laid limply on the conference table. Her forehead was full of sweat as she panted lightly like a little fish on the verge of death. Her body was still trembling pitifully. She breathed with all her might and wanted to move, but her whole body was limp and she could not move at all. You want me to do this to you, right? His voice rang out from behind her, low and deep. As he pressed against her, she could feel the changes in his body. However, he did not seem to have any intention of touching her. He only wanted her to break down. He only wanted her to lose her composure in front of him. He was abominable. Pei Chi started crying. She had never felt so weak before. She had never felt this way before. It was as if Yu Wang had been brought to a new world and was being forced to admit that he was a shameless person. That scared her, shamed her. Pei Chi, he whispered in her ear, I want you to think about how I treat you when you have a meeting here in the future. She was dazed for a moment, but he had risen and left her sprawled in that miserable state. Tang Yu's voice was cold. You can try the consequences of moving to that godforsaken place. She couldn't take it anymore and lay on the ground in a sorry state. I hate you. He bent down and patted her rosy cheeks. His elegant face smiled bewitchingly. Pei Chi, hate me. It's better than forgetting. With that, he opened the door and walked out. After he left, Pei Chi moved a little and felt weak again. She bit her lip in anger. After a long time, she straightened herself up and tidied herself up. Her fingers were trembling as she buttoned her shirt. It took her a long time to button it up. However, her legs were so weak that she had to hold on to the conference table to stand properly. 5 minutes later, Little One walked in and looked at Pei Chi carefully. President Pei, the moving company is rushing us. Pei Chi sat down slowly. She looked a little tired as she sat there. Let them move the things back. Chapter 412. Xiaowen sighed in her heart when she saw Pei Chi-Chi's stunned expression. She didn't know what happened between Boss Pei and Mr. Tang, but it seemed to be a big deal. It seemed like there was a misunderstanding or a knot that couldn't be untied. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was a little low. Xiaowen, go out first. I want to be alone. Xiaowen hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, All right, Boss Pei. I'll go and arrange things outside. She left and closed the door considerately. As Pei Chi sat there, she started to cry from smiling. She was not naive or stupid. Even Tang Yu couldn't decide immediately. It was not just about feelings, but also about the entire family. The Tang family, the Lin family. She knew that he was struggling and in pain. So she would rather she make such a decision. Tang Yu, do you believe in fate? She felt that this was the fate between the two of them. Promise me. Leave me. Pei Chi laughed and cried. She smiled and said to herself, Peiqiqi, it's not a big deal. No matter how painful it was, how painful could it be? Downstairs, Tang Yu sat in the car. Meng Qingcheng was driving. Looking at his boss's pale face, he admitted that he was gloating a little. Looking at their wise and powerful Mr. Tang now being so disgraced because of Peiqiqi, he felt a little sour just thinking about it. Meng Qingcheng focused on the road while driving and asked casually, "Actually, it's just a matter of a little girl. Just pamper her a little. Why do you have to be so serious?" After saying that for a long time, Tang Yu didn't say anything. Meng Qingcheng glanced back and didn't say anything. He had already guessed what might happen. After all, he had long felt that Peiqiqi looked like a person, and Tang Yu's current reaction also showed that his guess should be true. Even Meng Qingcheng didn't dare to say anything about this matter. Tang Yu closed his eyes in the back seat as if he was resting. However, his cell phone rang. Meng Qingcheng was focused on driving, but he also pricked up his ears to listen. Tang Yu looked at the number. It was Sun Feifei's. Sun Feifei. If she hadn't called, he would have forgotten who she was. He frowned but still picked up the call. Sun Feifei's voice came from the other end of the line. "Tang Yu, I have a small concert this week." Before she could finish, he interrupted her rudely. "I think I told you that we are working together." Sun Feifei wasn't unhappy. Instead, she smiled and said, "I remember. But Tang Yu, I just wanted to hear your unhappy voice. Did you not make up with Peiqiqi? Chasing after a woman doesn't feel good, does it?" "Actually, I'm in a bad mood today, but I feel better when I hear that someone is in a worse mood than me." Sun Feifei's tone became lighter. Listening to the woman's irritated voice, Tang Yu was upset and hung up the phone with a black face. Meng Qingcheng was trying to hold back his laughter. Actually, he had heard it too. This Sun Feifei was really, actually, she's quite cute. Why don't we take her in as a concubine? Meng Qingcheng joked. Tang Yu's face darkened even more. He looked at Meng Qingcheng and said, "Why do I feel that she's a good match for you? Just as talkative, just as gossipy." Chapter 413. However, it wasn't Sun Feifei on the other end of the line. It was a servant from the house. Her voice was trembling. "Sir, Miss doesn't look well. Do you want to come back and take a look?" Tang Yu tightened his grip on the phone. His voice was tense too. "Call the family doctor over. I'll be back soon." He didn't hang up the phone. He instructed Meng Qingcheng, "Qingcheng, drive faster. We're going back to Rose Garden." Meng Qingcheng knew where Tang Xian was staying recently. He guessed that something had happened to Tang Xian. He stepped on the accelerator and the car sped up to 120 kilometers per hour. They ran through countless red lights and arrived at Rose Garden in 20 minutes. Tang Yu opened the car door and ran to the second floor. A maid ran behind him and said, "The family doctor is here. He said she's not in danger, but she has to be admitted to the hospital." Tang Yu knew what to do. He pursed his lips and didn't say anything. Upstairs, the doctor was giving Tang Xian a nutrient injection. Tang Xian was already asleep, but her face was still pale. When Tang Yu reached the door, he slowed down his pace. He sat down beside Tang Xian and caressed her cold face. He asked the doctor in a low voice, "Is she okay?" The doctor had been treating Tang Xian for a long time. He knew about her condition and reported it truthfully. Maybe she's been experiencing emotional ups and downs lately. Also, her illness has been dragging on for too long. "Mr. Tang, it's better for you to find a compatible bone marrow." Tang Yu was silent. "Let her stay in the hospital for a while. It'll help stabilize her condition." The doctor looked at the lively and adorable girl and felt a little pity. Being born in such a wealthy family, her life and death were beyond her control, especially since her mother had been involved in a scandal recently. Tang Yu nodded and asked someone to send the doctor away. He stayed by Tang Xian's side until she woke up. It was already dusk. There was only a dim yellow light in the bedroom. Tang Xian opened her eyes and saw Tang Yu's handsome face. She felt like she was in a dream. She stretched out her little hand and called out, "Big brother," like a kitten. Tang Yu smiled warmly and let her rest on his arm. "Do you want to eat something?" Tang Xian was as weak as a kitten. She lay there without moving. Her oval face was small to begin with, but now it seemed even smaller. She kept looking at Tang Yu and said in a weak voice, "Big brother, I dreamed that Mom and Dad got divorced. Mom was covered in blood, and she didn't want me anymore." Tang Yu reached out and hugged her. "No, she won't abandon you." His heart was a little soft and cold. Even though he knew that Tang Xian wasn't his biological sister, he had doted on her for so many years. He couldn't just let her go so easily. Now that she was as weak as a kitten, he couldn't bear to hurt her. Tang Xian hugged Tang Yu's waist and buried her face in Tang Yu's chest, sobbing. The child was having a nightmare. Tang Yu hugged her, his heart heavy. In the end, Tang Xian was still hospitalized. She was obedient. When she was hospitalized, she always had a smile on her face and seemed to be fine. Tang Yu knew that she was afraid. This illness had been with Tang Xian for more than 10 years. There wasn't a child who wasn't afraid of it. Tang Ziyuan came to visit a few times. But because of Zhaoku, he didn't get along with Tang Xian like before. It was awkward. When there was no one around, Tang Xian would sit on the bed and look out the window. No one knew that she was thinking about Zhaoku. Chapter 414. How was she now? Would she still look as ugly as the other day? She couldn't stand not being pretty. Would anyone beat her up there? Tang Xian didn't dare to ask. She was afraid that people would be unhappy. Because in everyone's eyes, her mother was a bad woman. But a bad woman was also her mother. She lay there in a daze. She looked so weak and pitiful. Only when Meng Qingcheng came to visit her after work could she be happy. That was probably the only time she was happy. Tang Yu stood outside the window and looked at Tang Xian through the transparent glass. This time, Tang Xian underwent chemotherapy. Her hair was shaved off, and she became bald. Tang Yu looked at her quietly. Suddenly, he walked to the end of the corridor and dialed Pei Chi-Chi's number. She picked up after a few rings. They were speechless after what he had done to her that day. After a long time, Tang Yu said in a hoarse voice, "Come to Shengyuan Hospital. Tang Xian is hospitalized." Pei Chi-Chi was shocked. She hurried to ask, but Tang Yu had already hung up. He didn't know why he waited for a few days before looking for Pei Chi-Chi. Maybe it was because he didn't want her to extract his bone marrow. It would be painful. He loved her, hated her, and felt his heart ache. Whenever he thought of her, his heart would go numb. Tang Yu smiled bitterly. He lowered his head, took out a cigarette from his pocket, and lit it up. Pei Chi-Chi came over when he was smoking his 5th cigarette. She looked at him from afar. It was as if she was looking at loneliness. She slowly walked towards him, one step at a time. This was something she wanted to do, but she didn't dare to do it. But now, because of Tang Xian, they were entangled once again. Tang Yu looked at her and put away the cigarette in his hand. "What's wrong with Tang Xian?" She looked up at him and asked anxiously. His eyes were deep. "Let's talk outside." He brought her to the top floor of the hospital. It was a huge balcony. The weather was gloomy and the wind was strong. The wind blew her long hair up, covering her face. Tang Yu stood a step away from her. For the first time, he told her the truth that even he was unwilling to admit. "Pei Chi-Chi, Tang Xian has been sick since she was young. Leukemia." Pei Chi-Chi was stunned. She stood there, her feet rooted to the ground, motionless. The sound of the wind whistling in her ears mixed with Tang Yu's words. "What? Tang Xian has leukemia?" After a long time, she raised her hand and pushed aside her long hair mechanically. Her midnight eyes stared at him. In his eyes, besides shock, there was also panic. Time seemed to have stopped. All that was left was Tang Xian's words. His lips suddenly became a little dry. He wanted to speak, but not a single word came out. After a long time, her eyes regained their vigor. She stared at Tang Yu and said, "Say that again." "Tang Xian needs a bone marrow transplant. You're the last unmatched blood relative. He tried his best to speak without emotion. She grabbed his arm and pursed her lips. Take me there. I want to see Tang Xian. Tang Yu looked at her with a burning gaze. Pei Chi, aren't you afraid of pain? She used to bite off a piece of his flesh with a small injection. Bone marrow transplant required a puncture. Pei Chi pursed her lips and did not say a word. Of course she was afraid, but she was more afraid that something would happen to Tang Xian. She had already taken away Tang Xian's mother. She did not want Tang Xian to lose her life. Chapter 415. He held her hand, and when he did so, Pei Chi was startled for a moment. But she didn't break free. Now, her legs were weak, her body was weak, and her heart was trembling. She needed someone to hold her. She grabbed him, looked up, and said in a weak voice, "Take me to the lab." And he looked at her deeply. Half an hour later, Pei Chi sat in the blood collection room. She was alone. She pursed her lips and stretched out her slender arms. When the nurse inserted the needle, Pei Chi's eyelashes trembled and she closed her eyes tightly. She was still very afraid, but she didn't make a sound. She closed her eyes quietly and waited for the pain to come. Then, she was pulled into a warm embrace. It was a long-lost embrace. After she ran away from the marriage, even though they had physical contact or done it a few times, his embrace was not as warm as it was now. Pei Chi closed her eyes and couldn't help hugging his waist. Her fingertips touched his warm body temperature. Tang Yu's body became a little tense when she touched him. He hugged her with one hand and covered her eyes with the other, not letting her look at the blood. Her little face was buried in his lower abdomen. Her hair was soft and fluffy, and she was like a weak animal, shivering in his arms. His heart was sour, and he couldn't describe the feeling. The nurse saw that, and her hands became gentler. Finally, 5 tubes of blood were drawn. The color of Pei Chi's lips was almost as pale as a piece of white paper. She was still huddled in his arms, and her voice was very soft and trembling. "Where is Tang Xian? I want to see her." "Okay." Tang Yu closed his eyes. "Don't tell her." She and Tang Xian were sisters, and they were even close sisters. It had nothing to do with Tang Yu, but he would rather let Tang Xian think that she was his sister. He would rather let Tang Xian think that Chi was Chi and not his sister. Because of this, Chi was destined to pay a huge price. After she calmed down for a while, Tang Yu helped her up with one hand and walked towards the ward. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she suddenly asked him at the door. Tang Yu remained silent for a moment before saying indifferently, "Pei Chi, you're not the only one who feels helpless." Apart from that, he did not say a single word. Pei Chi pursed her lips and stood at the door for a while before she broke free from Tang Yu and walked in. When Tang Xian saw her, she was both happy and a little guilty. She sat there and asked, "Chi, why are you here?" She didn't want Chi to see her bald head. It was also the first time Pei Chi saw Tang Xian's bald head. Her heart and nose were sour. Tang Xian was such a beautiful girl. She still remembered the first time she saw Tang Xian. Tang Xian had a princess's head and looked very ladylike. It was the look of her dreams. Her gaze was a little straight. Tang Xian touched her head awkwardly. "Am I ugly?" Pei Chi's eyes were a little warm. She held it in and forced a smile. "How can that be? Our Tang Xian is beautiful no matter how I look at it." Tang Xian replied with an "oh." She obviously didn't believe it. She whimpered and looked at Pei Chi. "Chi, can I stay at your place when I recover?" She was afraid to go home, and her brother was very busy. She wanted to go to Chi-Chi's place. She didn't know why, but she just wanted to be close to Chi-Chi. Chapter 416. Pei Chi reached out and touched her little bald head, her fingers fondly stroking her small nose and small face. She didn't realize it in the past, but now she really felt that it was so precious. Tang Xian felt that Chi-Chi's gaze was a little weird when she was being touched like that. She looked at her like a puppy looking at a bone, but at the same time, she yearned for this feeling. With a whimper, she hugged Pei Chi. Chi, if I die, you must remember to miss me. You don't have to miss me too much, just think about me occasionally. Pei Chi had an indescribable feeling in her heart. She closed her eyes. I won't, I'll be fine, Tang Xian said pitifully, but I've waited for so many years, and it still hasn't happened. Her little face rested on Pei Chi's shoulder, her little hand holding it gently. Chi, don't be sad. Pei Chi hugged her little body, trying her best to hold back her tears. I'm not sad, I'm really not sad. But her voice was choked. Now, Pei Chi began to doubt her decision. Zhao Ke's imprisonment was too cruel for Tang Xian. Tang Xian's voice was soft. You're still saying you're not sad? Chi, you're about to cry. She didn't want to tell Chi because she didn't want Chi to feel sad. I'm not crying, Tang Xian, I'm not crying. Pei Chi closed her eyes. The nurse came in, followed by the doctor. She looked at the hugging couple awkwardly and said to Tang Yu in a low voice, Mr. Tang, it's time for Tang Xian's chemotherapy. Chemotherapy? Pei Chi felt Tang Xian's body tremble when she heard that word. So did she. She hugged her even tighter. Chi, I'm going for treatment. Tang Xian sniffled and said softly. She was afraid, but she was more afraid that her brother and Chi would worry, and her father, who would sigh every time he came. Pei Chi hugged her even tighter. She did not want to let go. She did not want Tang Xian to suffer such pain. It had only been a few days, and Tang Xian had lost a lot of weight. Her face was pale, and she didn't look like a 16-year-old girl anymore. Chi. Tang Xian gently pushed her away and smiled at her. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt at all. The more she acted like this, the more uncomfortable Pei Chi felt. Tang Xian got off the bed, put on some clothes and followed the doctors and nurses. Pei Chi wanted to follow, but Tang Yu held her back. His voice was a little hoarse. Bring her back in 2 hours. Tang Xian didn't want anyone to watch her suffer through chemotherapy. She said it was ugly. Pei Chi was stopped from behind. Tang Yu hugged her and said in a deep voice, Don't go. She has her own pride. She looked at the door and pursed her lips. After a while, she turned around and looked at Tang Yu. I can match her, right? Only a 50% chance, he said honestly. Pei Chi was stunned. After a while, she said in a daze, if I had known, I wouldn't have chosen to plot against Zhao Ke. She was thinking about what if Tang Xian didn't recover? What if that day came? She would rather Tang Xian had the last bit of happiness. She looked at Tang Yu and was on the verge of breaking down. It's me. It's my fault. Tang Yu, why? Why didn't you tell me earlier? Tang Yu looked at her crazy look and his heart sank. He pressed her shoulders with both hands. It's not your fault. Chapter 417. Tang Xian was her younger sister. She had plotted against Zhao Ke. She knew this would happen, but she didn't expect Tang Xian to have such an illness. Now, you don't have a choice. He stared into her eyes. Pei Chi, is there any use in regretting? Pei Chi looked a little dazed. She murmured, There's no use in regretting. Also, you're not at fault. We can't let a guilty person off just because of Tang Xian. He finally brought her into his arms. His tense chin rested on her hair, and his voice was a little hoarse. Chi, this isn't your fault. She cried pitifully in his arms. It's my fault. Otherwise, why would you treat me like this? Why? She cried in his arms and couldn't stop crying. Soon, his chest was wet with tears, and it was hot and uncomfortable. He hugged her. He hadn't hugged her like this for a long time. At such a time, when both of their hearts were wet and in pain, they hugged each other and became each other's warmth. But this warmth was only temporary. Pei Chi came back to her senses and carefully moved away from his embrace. She stood 2 steps away from him. Tang Yu looked down at her chest and smiled faintly. He didn't say anything and went outside to smoke a cigarette. They used to be the closest people, but now they were the most unfamiliar people. They could both treat Tang Xian well, but it was hard for them to hug each other like they used to, and it was hard for them to love Fong Yan. After Tang Yu carried Tang Xian back, she fell asleep with tears on her face. She said it didn't hurt, so how could it be? Pei Chi sat there for a long time, from day to night, and then from night to dawn. Tang Xian didn't wake up, so she stayed there and only ate a little. Tang Yu was the same. He had stood by the window for the whole night. No one could sleep tonight, because the hospital was doing the matching as fast as they could, and the results would be out early in the morning. None of them could sleep, and it was destined to be a difficult night. The first rays of the morning sun shone into the ward, injecting a trace of vitality into their fatigue. Pei Chi felt like a century had passed. She lifted her eyes and faced the window. It was dazzling. She subconsciously blocked it with her hand, but she was unwilling to move it away. Tang Yu stood there, leaning against the window with his back to the light, so she couldn't see his expression clearly. He leaned back, looking relaxed, but she knew he was tense. Just like that, the two of them looked at each other. After a long time, he asked her hoarsely, "Pei Chi, what do you think is important to you?" She could not speak, and could only stare at him blankly. Is it pride, face, or hatred? He walked towards her and kissed her under the first ray of sunlight. Pei Chi was stunned for a moment, then she subconsciously struggled a little. He held her shoulders with one hand to stop her from moving and pressed the back of her head with the other. The kiss wasn't deep, but it wasn't shallow either. They helped each other in times of need. At this moment, the powerful Tang Yu actually felt a sense of fear. Tang Xian was not only his sister, but she was also Pei Chi-Chi's sister. Without Tang Xian, what was left between them? Those love can support their short-lived feelings? After a long time, he let go of her. Both of their breaths were in a mess. Pei Chi maintained her previous posture, unable to move at all. Chapter 418. Tang Yu did not say a word. In fact, he had been waiting for her to throw herself into his arms, waiting for her to say, "Tang Yu, I don't care about anything else, I only care about you. Other people and other things are not important, I just want to be with you. Pei Chi, the one who can't let go of her hatred is you." He looked at her from above, reaching out to caress her soft cheeks. She was so delicate, so small, yet she was burdened with hatred. Did she feel that she could not rely on him anymore? Because he was Tang Yu, because of his mother, because of Jin Rong, she felt that she was not worthy of loving him. "What do you want?" She looked into his eyes. Her voice was anxious and a little fearful. Tang Yu's fingers were still caressing her red lips. After a long time, he said softly, "Chi, I want you to be happy." So, he did not force her, but he did not allow her to leave. He knew that even if he forced her, they would not be happy together. Life was not a fairy tale. The final destination of a relationship was marriage, where they could sleep on the same bed every day, where they could have many children. His mother could also give her sincere blessings. She would not feel guilty after meeting his mother, and would not feel that she had done something wrong. This fool always felt that it was her fault. How could she be wrong? She had always been the most innocent. Tang Xian was pitiful, but she still had a lot of love, while his little fool had always been alone. He admitted that he had treated her poorly these past few days. Tang Yu sighed, as if he had understood a lot of things in one night. He reached out and stroked her fluffy hair, saying nothing else. He had made up his mind, and he knew that his decision would cause a bloodbath between the Tang and Lin families, but he still wanted her. He did not want to hide it from his mother, but he would be put in a difficult position, put his mother in a difficult position, put Pei Chi in a difficult position, and put himself in a difficult position. He remembered that Tang Xan had said, "Brother, we will live together with Chi from now on." Then they would live together, the three of them. Pei Chi was stunned. She looked up at him. At this moment, she was weak and helpless. Tang Yu lowered his head and whispered in her ear, "Pei Chi, you have to hold on. I will wait for you here, waiting for you to experience the vicissitudes of life, waiting for you to come to my side." She was still in a daze, and he gave her one last indulgence, a kiss on her mouth. When he straightened his body, the sun was already blazing outside. It was a new day. Tang Xian woke up. She laid on the bed, her whole body still aching. She just lay there and watched as her brother kissed Chi. It was as if all the pain in his body had disappeared in an instant. In that instant, everything became infinitely beautiful. Her brother and Chi seemed to have fulfilled a dream in her heart. Her brother and Chi did what she couldn't do. Tang Xian just stood there and watched. She felt that she was very happy right now. The three of them were already living together. But now, the three of them did not know that they were living together in that way. She did not want them to know that she was awake. So when her brother straightened his body, she quietly closed her eyes again. But the corner of his mouth lifted, revealing a faint smile. The smell of disinfectant in the ward had become sweet. Chapter 419. At 8 o'clock, the housekeeper came with breakfast. Tang Yu asked Pei Chi to accompany Tang Xian. Pei Chi helped Tang Xian wash up and coaxed her to eat. Although she was chatting happily with Tang Xian, Pei Chi's heart was in a knot. She wished she could go and find out the result immediately. Chi, you're feeding into my nostrils. Tang Xian's voice was as soft as a kitten's, with a hint of mischief. Are you thinking of your brother? Pei Chi smiled faintly and shook her head. Nonsense. Tang Xian laughed too. I'm not talking nonsense. Chi, you're blushing. Pei Chi reached out to touch her face. Tang Xian giggled. Pei Chi realized she had been tricked. She glared at Tang Xian. Eat your food. Tang Xian nodded obediently. As long as you don't feed into my nostrils, Chi. Pei Chi was still glaring at her. Tang Xian whimpered. All right, Chi, I'll eat. She pitifully tried to please Tang Xian. She almost wagged her tail. Pei Chi focused on feeding her. Her heart ached when she saw Tang Xian's little face. Tang Xian ate half a bowl and couldn't eat anymore. Pei Chi wiped her mouth and helped her lie down. Tang Xian was very tired. She fell asleep after a while. Pei Chi covered her with the blanket and walked out after taking a look at her. She opened the door and saw Tang Yu. His face was a little gloomy. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, and her lips moved slightly. Let's talk outside, he said simply, and walked straight to the end of the corridor. Pei Chi followed him. Her head was buzzing, and her legs felt weak. She couldn't describe the feeling. Tang Yu stood there waiting for her. She walked over and looked up at him. Her voice was trembling. Tang Yu, can I? There was a hint of pain in his eyes and his lips were tightly pursed. After a comparison, your bone marrow doesn't match with Tang Xian's. In other words, not even Pei Chi could save Tang Xian. Pei Chi was stunned. Although his expression said it all, when she heard it, she was still shocked, disappointed, and even desperate. Gray enveloped her body. Slowly, his whole body became ice cold. She was still looking up at him, her lips slightly parted as she gazed at him. But tears were already rolling down her cheeks. No amount of tears could save Tang Xian, but she couldn't control it. Her body began to tremble. She began to tremble in fear. In this world, Tang Xian was her only family. Was there no way to save such a lively little girl? She remembered the first time she saw Tang Xian. She was so lively. She loved to call her Chi. She loved to eat her food. She loved to stick to her. She loved to say, Chi, your hair is so straight, your waist is so slim, and your butt is so perky. She couldn't save Tang Xian like that. The sunlight shone on them through the glass, giving them a golden edge, but it couldn't reach her heart. If we can't find a match, how long can she live? Finally, she asked him softly. Tang Yu's voice was a little hoarse. The doctor said that she won't live past 20. In fact, if Tang Xian wasn't born in the Tang family, she wouldn't even live past 10. Pei Chi closed her eyes. Her fingers were clenched so tightly that they sank into her flesh. She couldn't feel anything anymore. She couldn't feel the pain. Chapter 420. At that time, Director Hao looked at him and said hesitantly, "There's another way. Mr. Tang, you and Miss Pei are Tang Xian's blood relatives. If the two of you have a child, the child's cord blood might be a good match." Tang Yu wouldn't give up even if there was a glimmer of hope. However, he didn't want to tell Pei Chi. If he did, she would definitely ask to have a child with him immediately. It would be an insult to their relationship. He wanted her to be with him willingly, not to save Tang Xian. He wanted her to love him with all her heart. Tang Yu was even a little jealous. He was a little jealous that she cared for Tang Xian too much. Fortunately, Tang Xian was obedient during her chemotherapy. She hired the best doctor and used the best medicine. Her condition was stabilized, and she could go home after staying for half a month. Pei Chi often came to keep Tang Xian company. Whenever she came, Tang Xian would be happier and pester her with all sorts of questions. Pei Chi cooked chicken noodles for Tang Xian. Tang Xian was satisfied. She wiped her mouth and looked at Pei Chi. Chi, why don't you and brother see each other? Chi would come in the morning and brother would come at night. That was weird. Why do we have to see each other? Pei Chi mimicked her. Tang Xian whimpered. Chi, don't you like brother anymore? Yeah. Pei Chi nodded. We broke up. Tang Xian looked at her pitifully and said, "But will people who have broken up also do embarrassing things?" Pei Chi looked at Tang Xian with a puzzled expression. Tang Xian's small face was filled with pride. Brother said it himself. Didn't he have a hickey on his neck? He admitted that it was you. Chi. Then, Tang Xian looked at Pei Chi with an infuriating gaze, as if she wanted her to be responsible for her brother. Pei Chi was speechless. She glared at Tang Xian, but she was shocked. Hickey? That was what they saw during Chinese New Year. Then the night before, that dream? Is it true? She and Tang Yu rolled around for a night? And she remembered that in the dream, she had been eating from him. Pei Chi was shocked and panicked. Why did he deliberately make her think that it was Sun Feifei? Tang Xian looked at her expression and was even more pleased with herself. She raised her head and said, Chi, I told you that you couldn't forget your brother. Pei Chi didn't say anything. She was still in a daze. At that moment, Tang Ziyuan came over, followed by 2 medical staff. They were talking as they walked over. Tang Ziyuan was stunned when he saw Pei Chi. These days, he did not come often, nor did he see Pei Chi. Now that he saw it, other than being surprised, he also had an indescribable feeling. Miss Pei, are you here to see Tang Xian? Tang Ziyuan knew that Zhao Ku did not like Pei Chi. He had already divorced Zhao Ku and Pei Chi seemed to have broken up with Tang Yu, so it didn't matter anymore. But he was worried that Pei Chi had an ulterior motive for visiting Tang Xian. Maybe she regretted it and wanted to be with Tang Yu again? After the incident with Zhao Ku, Tang Ziyuan was very wary of women, especially beautiful women. The doctor was talking to Tang Xian. Tang Ziyuan said calmly, Miss Pei, do you mind if we talk outside? Pei Chi could guess what he wanted to say, so she nodded. After walking out, Tang Dion looked at Pei Chi and noticed that she looked a little haggard. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.